Most people think curiosity is just a nice-to-have personality trait, but neuroscientists have discovered it literally rewires your brain for success. You've probably noticed how some people seem to effortlessly navigate life's challenges while others get stuck in the same patterns for years. The difference isn't intelligence, luck, or even hard work. It's something far simpler, yet more powerful. I used to believe that asking questions made me look weak or unprepared, especially in professional settings. I would nod along in meetings, pretending to understand concepts I'd never heard of, convinced that admitting ignorance would damage my credibility. Then I stumbled across research from Harvard showing that people who ask more questions are perceived as significantly more competent and likable by their peers. This completely flipped my understanding of how curiosity actually works in the real world. What I discovered next changed not just how I approached conversations, but how I approached every aspect of my life. The strategies I'm about to share have helped thousands of people unlock opportunities they never knew existed, simply by shifting how they engage with the world around them. By the end of this video, you'll have a practical framework for turning everyday curiosity into your most valuable career and life asset. Part 1. The Ignorance Inversion Technique. Here's something that's going to sound completely backwards at first, but stick with me, because this one shift in thinking will transform how people see you and how quickly you learn anything. Most people spend enormous amounts of energy trying to appear smart, nodding along in meetings, pretending they understand concepts they've never heard before, and desperately hoping no one discovers what they don't know. But what if I told you that the most successful people do the exact opposite? This first technique out of 6 revolutionary approaches is called the Ignorance Inversion Technique, and it's based on a fascinating discovery from Harvard researchers that completely flips everything we've been taught about appearing competent. You see, we've been conditioned from childhood to believe that admitting ignorance makes us look weak, unprepared, or frankly, stupid. Teachers rewarded students who had the answers, not the ones asking questions. Bosses promoted employees who seemed to know everything, not those who admitted gaps in their knowledge. But here's where it gets interesting. The Harvard study revealed something shocking. People who ask more questions are actually perceived as significantly more competent and likable by their peers. Not less competent, more competent. The researchers discovered that when someone admits they don't understand something and asks for clarification, it triggers what psychologists call the teacher's high in the other person. Their brain literally releases dopamine when they get to explain a concept, creating an incredibly positive association with you. Think about the last time someone asked you to explain something you knew well. Remember that feeling of satisfaction, of being valued for your knowledge. That's dopamine at work. And the person asking the question just became someone your brain associates with feeling good. This is the exact opposite of what happens when someone pretends to understand. When you nod along without truly comprehending, you miss the learning opportunity. You can't contribute meaningfully to the conversation, and you risk being exposed later when your lack of understanding becomes obvious. The ignorance inversion technique is beautifully simple, but requires courage. Instead of hiding what you don't know, you strategically highlight your knowledge gaps. But there's a specific way to do this that maintains your credibility while accelerating your learning. You don't just say, "I don't get it." You use precise language that shows you're engaged and thinking critically. Here's the exact phrase that changes everything. I want to make sure I understand this correctly. This simple sentence does 3 powerful things simultaneously. First, it shows you're paying attention and care about accuracy. Second, it demonstrates intellectual humility, which research shows is one of the most attractive qualities in both personal and professional relationships. Third, it opens the door for deeper explanation without making you seem incompetent. But the magic doesn't stop there. When you consistently use this approach, something remarkable happens. People start seeking you out. They want to share their knowledge with you because you make them feel valued as teachers. You become known as someone who asks thoughtful questions, someone who helps others clarify their own thinking. Your reputation shifts from the person who pretends to know everything to the person who helps everyone think more clearly. I learned this technique the hard way. For years, I sat in meetings pretending to understand industry jargon, nodding sagely while having no idea what acronyms meant or what processes people were discussing. I thought I was protecting my reputation, but I was actually limiting my growth and contribution. The day I started saying, "I want to make sure I understand this correctly," was the day my career trajectory changed completely. Your immediate action step is incredibly simple, but potentially life-changing. In your very next meeting or important conversation, identify one concept you're unclear about and ask a specific clarifying question using that exact phrase. Watch what happens. Notice how the other person's energy shifts. Pay attention to how much more you learn and how much more valuable you become to the conversation. This brings us to the second technique, which takes this concept of strategic curiosity and applies it to how you choose what to learn next. Part 2. The adjacent discovery method. Now that you understand how powerful it is to embrace your knowledge gaps, let me show you where to direct that curiosity for maximum impact. Most people make a critical mistake when deciding what to learn next, and this mistake keeps them trapped in incremental thinking instead of breakthrough innovation. This second technique out of 6 is called the adjacent discovery method, and it's based on a pattern I noticed while studying the world's most innovative thinkers. Here's what's fascinating. When you look at major breakthroughs in any field, they almost never come from people who went deeper into their existing expertise.
Instead, they come from people who made unexpected connections between seemingly unrelated domains. But here's where most people go wrong. When they decide to expand their learning, they look for adjacent fields. If you're in marketing, you might study sales or customer service. If you're in software development, you might learn about product management or user experience design. These are logical choices, and they're exactly what everyone else is doing. This means you're competing with thousands of other people who have the same knowledge combinations. The adjacent discovery method works differently. Instead of looking 1 degree away from your expertise, you look exactly 2 degrees away. This creates what I call the insight gap, a space where powerful connections exist, but almost no one is looking for them. If you're in marketing, instead of studying sales, you study anthropology and cognitive psychology. If you're in finance, instead of studying economics, you study behavioral science and systems theory. Why does this work so powerfully? Innovation happens at the intersection of different ways of thinking, but most people only explore intersections that are obvious and crowded. When you venture 2 degrees away from your field, you discover insights that your direct competitors will never find because they're not looking in those spaces. You start seeing patterns and solutions that are invisible to people who stay within traditional boundaries. Let me give you a concrete example. A friend of mine is a software engineer who was struggling to advance in his career. Instead of learning more programming languages or development frameworks like his peers, he decided to study improvisational theater and negotiation tactics. This seemed completely unrelated to coding, but here's what happened. The improv training taught him to think on his feet and collaborate more effectively with unpredictable team dynamics. The negotiation skills helped him communicate technical concepts to non-technical stakeholders and advocate for better project requirements. Within 6 months, he was promoted to a technical lead position, not because he was the best coder on the team, but because he could bridge the gap between technical and business concerns in ways his peers couldn't. His unique combination of skills made him irreplaceable. The other engineers were competing on coding ability, but he was operating in a completely different category. This is the power of the adjacent discovery method. You're not trying to be the best at what everyone else is studying. You're creating your own category by combining insights from unexpected sources. The key is choosing fields that are exactly 2 degrees removed from your expertise. 1 degree away and you're competing with everyone else. 3 degrees away and the connections become too abstract to be practically useful. Your brain is already wired to make these connections once you feed it the right information. Neuroscientists call this the distant association process. Your mind naturally looks for patterns and connections between different concepts you've learned, but it can only connect dots that exist in your knowledge base. When you study 2 degrees away from your field, you're giving your brain entirely new dots to connect. The immediate action step is to pick one field that's exactly 2 steps away from your expertise and spend 30 minutes today consuming content from that domain. If you're in human resources, you might study game design or urban planning. If you're in education, you might explore behavioral economics or architectural psychology. The key is choosing something that seems interesting but completely unrelated to your day job. Don't worry about how these insights will connect to your work. Trust that your brain will make those connections automatically over time. The goal is exposure to different ways of thinking, different problem-solving approaches, different vocabularies for describing challenges and solutions. This adjacent discovery approach sets you up perfectly for the 3rd technique, which shows you how to supercharge your learning process regardless of what you're studying. Part 3. The Question Archaeology Framework. Here's something that will revolutionize how you learn anything. Most people approach learning backwards, and this backwards approach is why they forget most of what they study within weeks. But there's a simple framework that can make your learning exponentially more effective, and it's based on how archaeologists approach their work. This 3rd technique out of 6 is called the Question Archaeology Framework, and it leverages a fascinating aspect of how your brain processes information. You see, when archaeologists approach a dig site, they don't just start digging randomly. They first spend extensive time examining the surface, forming hypotheses about what might be buried below, and developing specific questions they want to answer. Only then do they begin excavating, and their questions guide where they dig and what they look for. Most people do the opposite when learning. They dive into articles, videos, or courses without any clear questions in mind, hoping to absorb useful information. This is like digging randomly and hoping to find something valuable. Sometimes you get lucky, but mostly you waste enormous amounts of time and energy with minimal results. Your brain has a built-in system called the reticular activating system that determines what information gets your attention and what gets filtered out. Right now, as you're reading this, there are dozens of sounds, sights, and sensations around you that your brain is ignoring because they're not relevant to your current focus. But if I told you to listen for the sound of air conditioning or notice the feeling of your clothes against your skin, suddenly those sensations would become obvious. The same principle applies to learning. When you have specific questions in mind before you start researching, your reticular activating system flags relevant information and helps you notice connections you would otherwise miss. Information that answers pre-existing questions literally stands out more in your perception than random information you encounter. The Question Archaeology Framework works in 3 simple steps, but the results are dramatically more powerful than traditional learning approaches. First, before researching any topic, you spend 5 minutes writing down every question you currently have about it. Not just obvious questions, but curious questions, skeptical questions, practical questions, even silly questions. The goal is to activate your curiosity across multiple dimensions. Second, you research the answers to those questions. But here's the key. You're not passively consuming information, hoping something sticks. You're actively hunting for specific answers, which makes your brain much more engaged in the process. You'll find yourself remembering information better because it was connected to questions you cared about. Third, and this is where the magic happens. After you research the answers, you write down all the new questions that emerged from what you learned. This is the archaeological part. Each answer you discover reveals new layers of complexity and curiosity that you couldn't see before you started digging. Let me show you how this works with a practical example. Suppose you need to learn about project management. Most people would search for project management basics and start reading articles or watching videos. They might learn some useful information, but most of it will be forgotten within days because it wasn't connected to specific curiosity. Using the question archaeology framework, you'd first write down questions like, what makes some projects succeed while others fail? How do you handle team members who miss deadlines? What's the difference between managing a project and leading a team? How much planning is too much planning? What do you do when requirements change mid-project? Now, when you research project management, your brain is actively looking for answers to these specific questions. You'll notice information that directly addresses your curiosities, and you'll remember it better because it satisfies a pre-existing mental itch. But here's where it gets really powerful. After researching, you'll have new questions like, how do you balance stakeholder expectations with team capabilities? Or, what project management approach works best for creative versus technical work? This creates an exponential learning curve instead of a linear one. Each research session generates more sophisticated questions, which lead to deeper insights, which generate even better questions. Instead of learning random facts about project management, you're building a comprehensive understanding of the field guided by your evolving curiosity. The framework works for any topic, from technical skills to interpersonal relationships to creative pursuits. The key is always starting with questions, not answers. Most people skip this step because it feels like extra work, but it's actually the difference between learning that sticks and learning that disappears. Your immediate action step is to choose one topic you need to learn about and complete one full cycle of question archaeology today. Write down your questions first, research the answers, then write down the new questions that emerged. You'll be amazed at how much more engaged and effective your learning becomes when you approach it like an archaeologist rather than a passive consumer. This question-driven approach to learning becomes even more powerful when you combine it with the fourth technique, which shows you how to gather insights from multiple cognitive perspectives. Part 4. The Perspective Portfolio. Strategy. Most people make terrible decisions, not because they lack intelligence or information, but because they're trapped inside a single way of thinking. And here's what's fascinating. They don't even realize they're trapped because the walls of their cognitive prison are invisible to them. But there's a strategy that can break you out of this limitation and give you access to solutions that remain completely hidden to single perspective thinking. This fourth technique out of 6 is called the Perspective Portfolio Strategy, and it's based on a crucial insight about how different types of minds process the same information. Just like a financial portfolio protects you from market volatility by diversifying your investments across different asset classes, a perspective portfolio protects you from cognitive blind spots by diversifying your thinking across different cognitive styles. Here's the problem with how most people approach important decisions or challenges. They either rely entirely on their own thinking or they seek advice from people who think similarly to them. If you're analytically minded, you probably gravitate toward other analytical people. If you're creative, you likely surround yourself with other creative types. This creates what psychologists call homogeneous perspective bias. All your inputs come from the same cognitive tribe, which means you're missing entire categories of solutions. But different cognitive styles reveal different aspects of any problem. Analytical thinkers excel at breaking complex issues into components and identifying logical relationships. Creative thinkers see novel connections and generate unexpected alternatives. Practical thinkers focus on implementation and real-world constraints. Theoretical thinkers understand systems and underlying principles. Each style illuminates aspects that others cannot see. The perspective portfolio. Strategy requires you to deliberately seek out viewpoints from at least 3 different cognitive tribes before making any important decision. This isn't about finding people who agree with you or who have the same background. It's about accessing fundamentally different ways of processing information and generating solutions. Let me give you an example of how this works in practice. A few months ago, I was trying to decide whether to expand my business into a new market. My natural inclination was to analyze the data, create financial projections, and build a logical case for or against the expansion. That's how my analytical mind works. But instead of stopping there, I applied the perspective portfolio strategy. First, I talked to a creative friend who doesn't think in spreadsheets and data points. She asked questions I never would have considered. What would this expansion feel like for your customers? How does this align with the story you want your brand to tell? What unexpected opportunities might emerge that you're not planning for? Her perspective revealed emotional and narrative aspects of the decision that were completely invisible to my analytical approach. Next, I consulted with someone who has a practical, implementation-focused mindset. He immediately started asking about logistics, resource allocation, and potential operational challenges. Do you have the systems in place to handle this expansion? What happens if demand exceeds your expectations? How will this affect your existing operations? His questions revealed practical constraints and implementation issues that I had overlooked in my theoretical analysis. Finally, I spoke with a theoretical thinker who focuses on systems and underlying principles. She helped me understand how this decision fit into larger market trends and long-term strategic positioning. What does this expansion signal about your company's evolution? How does this position you for future opportunities? What are the second and third-order effects of this decision? Her perspective revealed strategic implications that extended far beyond the immediate decision. The fascinating thing was that each conversation revealed completely different considerations and potential solutions. My analytical approach had identified one path forward based on financial projections. The creative perspective suggested a different approach focused on customer experience. The practical perspective highlighted implementation alternatives I hadn't considered. The theoretical perspective revealed strategic options that reframed the entire decision. When I synthesized insights from all 4 cognitive styles, I discovered a solution that was superior to anything any single perspective would have generated. Instead of a simple yes or no decision about market expansion, I developed a phased approach that addressed financial, creative, practical, and strategic considerations simultaneously. This is the power of perspective portfolio thinking. You're not just making better decisions, you're accessing solutions that exist only at the intersection of different cognitive approaches. Most people compete with others who think similarly to them, but when you consistently apply multiple perspectives, you start operating in a different category entirely. The key is recognizing that each cognitive style has legitimate strengths and blind spots. Analytical thinking provides rigor but can miss emotional and creative dimensions. Creative thinking generates novel possibilities but may overlook practical constraints. Practical thinking ensures feasibility but might miss innovative alternatives. Theoretical thinking reveals underlying principles but can become disconnected from real-world implementation. Your immediate action step is to identify one current challenge you're facing and reach out to someone whose thinking style is completely different from yours to get their perspective. If you're naturally analytical, find someone creative or practical. If you're naturally creative, seek out someone analytical or theoretical. The goal isn't to find someone who agrees with you, but someone who will reveal aspects of the challenge that you cannot see from your default perspective. This multi-perspective approach becomes even more powerful when combined with the fifth technique, which shows you how to identify and capitalize on knowledge gaps that others are missing. Part 5. The Curiosity Arbitrage System. Here's something that successful people understand but rarely talk about. The most valuable opportunities exist in the gaps between what experts know and what everyone else knows. And most people completely miss these gaps because they're looking in the wrong places. But there's a system for finding and exploiting these knowledge arbitrage opportunities that can transform your career and impact. This fifth technique out of 6 is called the Curiosity Arbitrage System, and it's based on a fascinating dynamic that exists in every field and industry. You see, experts in any domain accumulate deep knowledge over years or decades, but they also develop what psychologists call the curse of knowledge. They assume that information which seems basic to them is also common knowledge for everyone else. This creates massive gaps between what experts consider elementary and what the general public actually understands. Most people try to become experts by diving deeper into technical details, competing directly with people who have decades more experience. But there's a different strategy that's often more valuable: becoming a translator between expert knowledge and general application. The people who master this translation process often become more influential than the experts themselves because they make complex, valuable information accessible to people who need it. Think about some of the most successful educators, consultants, and thought leaders in any field. They're rarely the most technically advanced experts. Instead, they're people who excel at taking expert-level insights and presenting them in ways that normal people can understand and implement. They've found the arbitrage opportunity between expert knowledge and public comprehension. The Curiosity Arbitrage System works by identifying these gaps and positioning yourself as a bridge between worlds. But there's a specific process for finding these opportunities that most people miss. First, you need to identify information that meets 3 criteria. It's valuable to a broad audience, it's well understood by experts, and it's poorly explained or completely unknown to people who would benefit from it. Let me show you how this works with a concrete example. A few years ago, I noticed that cognitive scientists had developed fascinating insights about how memory works and how to learn more effectively. These weren't new discoveries. Researchers had known these principles for decades. But when I looked at how most people approached learning, they were using methods that directly contradicted what the science showed was most effective. There was a massive arbitrage opportunity. On one side, you had cognitive scientists with deep understanding of optimal learning strategies. On the other side, you had millions of students, professionals, and lifelong learners using ineffective methods because no one had translated the scientific insights into practical guidance they could understand and implement. I started creating content that bridged this gap, translating cognitive science research into practical learning strategies for non-experts. I wasn't conducting original research or making scientific discoveries. I was simply taking existing expert knowledge and making it accessible to people who needed it. This approach became far more valuable than trying to compete with cognitive scientists on their technical expertise. The key insight is that value often lies not in generating new knowledge, but in moving existing knowledge across boundaries. Experts are usually too focused on advancing their field to spend time on translation. Non-experts don't know what questions to ask or where to look for insights. The arbitrage opportunity exists in that gap. But you don't need to be a content creator or educator to apply this system. The same principle works in corporate environments, personal relationships, and virtually any context where different groups have different levels of knowledge about topics that matter to both. For instance, if you work in a company where the technical team has deep expertise but struggles to communicate with business stakeholders, you can create value by becoming fluent in both languages and serving as a translator. If you understand both the technical constraints and the business objectives, you become incredibly valuable to both groups. The process starts with identifying knowledge you already have that others in your network don't possess. This might be technical skills, industry insights, life experiences, or even lessons you've learned from mistakes. The key is recognizing that information, which seems basic to you, might be incredibly valuable to people who don't have your background or experience. Next, you find simple ways to share this knowledge with people who would benefit from it. This doesn't require creating courses or writing books. It might mean having conversations, writing internal memos, creating simple explanations during meetings, or answering questions that others are afraid to ask. The magic happens when you consistently do this across multiple domains. You become known as someone who can explain complex things simply, someone who helps others access insights they wouldn't find on their own. This reputation becomes incredibly valuable because it positions you as a connector and translator rather than just another expert competing for attention. Your immediate action step is to identify one thing you know that others in your network don't, and create a simple explanation or resource to share it with them. This might be a skill you've developed, an insight from your industry, a lesson you've learned, or even a useful tool or process you've discovered. The goal isn't to become a teacher or thought leader, but to start recognizing and capturing the value that exists in knowledge arbitrage opportunities. This translation approach becomes even more powerful when combined with the sixth and final technique, which shows you how to extract insights from successful people by asking the right questions. Part 6. The Reverse Engineering Ritual. Here's the most counterintuitive truth about learning from successful people. The questions everyone asks reveal almost nothing about why they actually succeed, and the questions almost no one asks unlock the real secrets behind exceptional performance. Most people waste incredible opportunities to learn from high achievers because they focus on what successful people do instead of understanding what they don't do. This sixth and final technique is called the Reverse Engineering Ritual, and it's based on a crucial insight about how excellence actually works. When most people encounter someone who's exceptionally good at something, they ask predictable questions. What's your morning routine? What books do you read? What strategies do you use? These questions focus on addition, what successful people have added to their approach that others haven't. But here's what's fascinating. Excellence often comes from subtraction and unconventional approaches, rather than addition. The most successful people have usually figured out what not to do, what assumptions to abandon, and what conventional wisdom to ignore. But these insights remain hidden when you only ask about what they do, because subtraction is invisible unless you specifically look for it. The reverse engineering ritual flips this approach completely. Instead of asking, "What do you do that makes you successful?" you ask two different questions that reveal the hidden architecture of exceptional performance. First, what do you not do that most people in your field do? Second, what assumptions did you have to abandon to get these results? These questions are powerful because they expose the decision-making framework that creates excellence, not just the surface behaviors that result from it. When you understand what successful people have consciously chosen not to do, you understand their priorities, their trade-offs, and their strategic thinking in ways that their actions alone don't reveal. Let me show you how this works with a real example. I once had the opportunity to interview an entrepreneur who had built and sold 3 successful companies. Instead of asking about his strategies or habits, I used the reverse engineering ritual. When I asked what he doesn't do that most entrepreneurs do, his answer was revelatory. He explained that he deliberately avoids networking events, doesn't read business books, and refuses to take meetings that don't have a specific agenda and clear expected outcome. This was the opposite of what most business advice suggests. But here's why it worked for him. By eliminating activities that seem productive but aren't actually moving his business forward, he freed up enormous amounts of time and mental energy to focus on the few things that create disproportionate results. When I asked about assumptions he had to abandon, he revealed something even more interesting. He had stopped believing that working harder automatically leads to better results. Instead, he focused on working on the right things with the right people at the right time. This shift from effort-based thinking to leverage-based thinking completely changed how he approached business decisions. These insights were far more valuable than learning about his morning routine or reading list, because they revealed the underlying principles that guided his decision-making. I could adapt these principles to my own situation in ways that copying his specific behaviors would never allow. The same pattern applies across every field. Elite athletes often succeed not because they train more than others, but because they've figured out what training to eliminate and what conventional wisdom about their sport is actually counterproductive. Top performers in creative fields usually have strong opinions about what not to create and what industry standards to ignore. But here's the key. Most people never discover these insights because they don't ask the right questions. They focus on what successful people do instead of understanding how they think about what not to do. This is why so many people try to copy successful behaviors without achieving similar results. They're copying the outputs without understanding the decision-making system that created those outputs. The reverse engineering ritual works because it reveals the invisible architecture of excellence. When you understand what someone has chosen not to do, you understand their values, priorities, and strategic framework. When you understand what assumptions they've abandoned, you can question your own assumptions and potentially discover breakthrough insights for your own situation. This approach requires courage because it often reveals that successful people ignore advice that seems obviously correct. It might turn out that someone you admire doesn't follow best practices that everyone else considers essential. But this is exactly why the approach is so valuable. It reveals unconventional wisdom that creates competitive advantages. Your immediate action step is to think of someone whose results you genuinely admire and reach out to them with these specific questions. Don't ask about their strategies or habits. Ask specifically about what they've stopped doing or what conventional wisdom they've rejected. You might be surprised by how willing people are to share these insights, because few people ever ask these questions. The insights you discover through this ritual will often be more valuable than months of studying conventional advice about success in that field. You'll start to see patterns in how exceptional performers think about subtraction, trade-offs, and unconventional approaches that create their competitive advantages. These 6 techniques represent a complete transformation in how you approach learning, decision-making, and personal growth. But here's what's most important. They work together as an integrated system, not just as isolated tactics. When you combine strategic ignorance with adjacent discovery, question archaeology with perspective portfolios, curiosity, arbitrage with reverse engineering, you create an approach to growth that operates in a completely different category from conventional learning. The ignorance inversion technique frees you from the exhausting pretense of having to know everything and transforms your knowledge gaps into relationship building and learning opportunities. The adjacent discovery method ensures you're developing insights that others in your field will never discover because they're looking in predictable places. The question archaeology framework makes your learning exponentially more effective by engaging your brain's natural pattern recognition systems. The perspective portfolio strategy protects you from the blind spots that trap single perspective thinking.
The curiosity arbitrage system positions you to create value by translating insights across knowledge boundaries. And the reverse engineering ritual reveals the hidden decision-making frameworks that create exceptional performance. But techniques are only valuable if you implement them. Your transformation begins with taking the first action step from any of these approaches. Choose the one that resonated most strongly with you and implement it today. Notice how it changes not just what you learn, but how you think about learning. Pay attention to how differently people respond to you when you embrace strategic curiosity instead of defensive knowledge hoarding. Remember that curiosity isn't just a nice personality trait. It's a strategic advantage that compounds over time. Every question you ask, every perspective you seek, every assumption you examine creates new possibilities that weren't visible before. The people who master these approaches don't just learn faster, they discover opportunities that others miss entirely. The idea that changed my mind forever was realizing that curiosity isn't a sign of weakness or ignorance. It's the most powerful tool for growth and connection that any of us possess. Your willingness to embrace what you don't know, combined with strategic approaches for expanding that knowledge, will determine how quickly you grow and how much impact you can create. Most people will watch this video and feel inspired but never take action. They'll wait for the perfect moment, the right opportunity, or until they feel more prepared. But the people who actually transform their lives are the ones who start immediately, even imperfectly. They understand that implementation beats inspiration every single time. Start today. Pick one technique, take one action step, and begin the process of transforming curiosity from a casual interest into your most valuable skill. Your future self will thank you for having the courage to embrace what you don't know, instead of pretending you know everything.